shootings across the U.S., including at an elementary school in Texas. A renewed conversation once again has been sparked about gun safety and gun violence all across the nation, including right here in Michigan. Joining us to discuss some of these issues and more is board chairperson Dr. Chris Smith from the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, back with us once again on the Michigan Megacast. Dr. Smith, thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Appreciate having you on, albeit not under great circumstances after the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas earlier on this week that took the lives of several children, as well as a teacher at the school, and so many others injured in the massacre once again at an elementary school. And so I want to start by asking you where your thoughts have gone in the wake of that shooting, especially considering so many years ago in 2012, when there was the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. That was a point where so many thought, well, this has to be it. This has to be the thing that causes the spark that causes the change, that causes those conversations to really get serious. And 10 years later, it's not, and we have another incident that is similar in so many ways and different in so many ways, but equally as tragic and sad. So what are your thoughts, or what were your thoughts in the wake of the news from earlier this week, at the time that we're broadcasting this live and recording this, of the shooting in Uvalde, Texas?
Well, of course, my first thought was, as you mentioned, how eerily similar this was to the Connecticut shooting in Newtown in 2012. Almost exactly 10 years ago. The Newtown shooting was December 2012, but we're talking about, essentially a full decade and an easy repeat of the same thing. And of course, I'm a parent, I'm a grandparent, as so many people are. You have this empathetic feeling about those families, about what those kids could have contributed to American society, what they could have achieved. Such a tragic waste. And of course, at the same time, because, in addition to being the board chairperson of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, I'm a professor of criminal justice at MSU. So, I've been very involved in studying law and policy related to this issue for over 35 years. And my mind, of course, immediately goes as well to, what could we do? What should we have done to try to lessen the risk of these things occurring? And of course, one of the things that really jumps out in the past couple weeks is you have two 18-year-olds, if we bring in the Buffalo shooting, which is very fresh in mind, the Buffalo grocery store, you have two 18-year-olds who could easily purchase weapons of war when they are not legally permitted to purchase a beer. And that ought to spark some serious thought about whether, and I don't view it as whether, about the fact that weapons are too easily available in the United States, including without sort of safeguards and mechanisms to slow down the process for people who are intent on misusing them as quickly as they can acquire them.
So, Dr. Smith, those who call themselves Second Amendment advocates, those who are advocating for so-called gun rights, in the wake of these tragedies, are arguing for those that are calling for changes and are calling out these politicians in particular that are supporting expansion of Second Amendment rights or no further restrictions or safeguards, so to speak, put in place to prevent or attempt to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening. They're imploring we shouldn't politicize this issue. But politics goes back to the root word of policy. Policies are put in place for the betterment of society, for the public health, for the safety and the welfare of the general public of the U.S., citizens, visitors, no matter who or whom is in U.S. territory. And so as someone that does study this issue and does study policy impacts on issues such as gun violence, what are some of the steps that can be taken from leaders, both statewide and certainly federally, in order to prevent tragedies like this, especially given the information that we do know over the past several weeks on many of these shooters, both in Uvalde, Texas, in Buffalo, New York, and beyond?
Well, sadly, of course, this has become an ideological issue for many people. And we need to look for ways to step back from ideology, both in having an understanding of the legal meaning of the Second Amendment. I've taught about the Second Amendment for over 35 years. I'm a lawyer and I have a PhD as a social scientist. And also think about the extent to which research might let us reduce these kinds of risks. But unfortunately, there are many people whose view of the Second Amendment is what they wish the Second Amendment would mean, not what the Supreme Court has said it means. As we stand here today, the legal meaning of the Second Amendment from the Supreme Court's decision in District of Columbia versus Heller in 2008 gives law-abiding adults the right to keep a handgun in their homes for self-protection. That is the Second Amendment right. Now, we all expect the Supreme Court's going to expand it to some opportunity to carry weapons. They're considering a case from New York right now, but there's never been a decision that says you have a right to purchase a military-style rifle, or you have a right to purchase a large-capacity magazine. There's some lower court judges doing those things, but not the Supreme Court. So this is really about the opportunity for legislators to make some decisions, as we do with other constitutional amendments, to find a balance between protecting the Second Amendment. It's part of the Constitution. I support the Second Amendment as it's defined, but also taking measures to protect people. And that really has to do with thinking about what are the weapons that are available to the public, what's the capacity of ammunition magazines, what are the ages, and for some purchases, not these, the gaps in the background check system. 22% of purchases are private purchases that don't go through background checks. And then we have some unreasonable restrictions in the background check system that say, if the bureaucratic process is too slow and takes more than 2 or 3 days, you automatically get the weapon, even if you wouldn't be qualified to purchase it. And we know in Michigan from the Oxford shooting that if we have safe storage laws, we may reduce the risk of adolescents getting a hold of unsecure firearms in their parents' home. Not to say that it prevents those things from happening, but it does create pressure on parents to secure their firearms. And many states have done these things, but Michigan simply is a place that probably is sort of in the middle of the 50 states with respect to laws that think about gun safety. We're not wide open like some states, and we don't have a list of things like some other states do. We're in the middle, but there are some specific things about strengthening background checks, safe storage laws, creating a mechanism like extreme risk protection orders. So if there is proof that someone is in crisis, if there's proof that someone is at risk of harming themselves or others, their weapons can be temporarily removed until such time that there is proof that that crisis has passed. Other states have these things. We don't.
And so you also, as you mentioned, you have a PhD in social science. And so when we look at the numbers across the board in the U.S., and especially, particularly for our audience here in the state of Michigan, what sort of support is there for the different policies, for this potential legislation that can go through at the state level and certainly even at the federal level for quote-unquote gun control laws or common sense gun safety laws or whatever you want to call them? Is there widespread support for that?
For certain things, right? So for example, and of course we rely on public opinion polling, but if you look at public opinion polling, there's super majorities in favor of strengthening background checks. I just saw a poll the other day. 2/3 of Americans would support banning military-style weapons. Strong majorities support safe storage laws, and majorities support extreme risk protection laws. The difficulties that we face in our political system is that we don't have the kind of democracy where what the public wants will necessarily be reflected in the policies that we have, because we have many profoundly undemocratic features in our system that permit active blocking of proposals. The fact that up until this year, our legislature, like many others, could be gerrymandered by one party to ensure that they maintain majority control. We have a system that lets people become president when they don't get the majority of votes in the country. We have a system where we have a Senate that has a filibuster rule, so you need 60 votes to get anything passed, even if you have majority support. We have a Senate in which the state of Wyoming, that has about 600,000 people, has the same representation of the state of California with 32 million people. These are profoundly undemocratic things, which were mechanisms of convenience in the 18th century to get states to agree to become a country. But they are defeating our efforts today to say, let's get the policies that the public supports.
We're joined by Dr. Chris Smith, the board chairperson of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, joining us on the Michigan Megacast. More information can be found at Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence.org. That's Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence.org for more information, as well as resources to learn more about these issues and do begin some of your own research on these so you can form more informed opinions about gun rights, about gun safety, about potential legislation, and upcoming events from the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. And so the NRA always is a factor, National Rifle Association, in these conversations on gun violence, on gun laws, on changing the status quo of policy on guns in the United States. And particularly because they are such a large funder of so many candidates, particularly those who are politically aligned conservative, except when it comes to gun laws, where they tend to be quite liberal. But interestingly enough, despite how much funding they are throwing at these candidates and these agreements they're throwing at these candidates, the NRA's filed for bankruptcy recently. How do they still wield so much power? Despite that being the case, you would think as they're having those financial issues, their power would diminish because you can't fund campaigns, you can't help fund campaigns, which, as you mentioned, another one of those things that's inherently undemocratic is campaign finance, a whole different issue. You would think if they can't finance these campaigns, their power would be significantly less.
Well, the NRA, starting back in the 1970s, became a very different organization. They went from an organization in the post-Civil War era that was seeking to help people, enjoy sport shooting and be, better at target shooting and competitions and gun safety. And in the 1970s, they were sort of taken over by a faction that was very committed to a particular vision of the Second Amendment and maximizing gun sales. The NRA is very heavily supported by gun manufacturers who seek to maximize gun sales. I mean, that's how corporations work in the United States. So they've given a lot of money over time, including in recent years. They're experiencing some heat now, of course, because of a lot of evidence of misspending and potential illegal misspending by their leadership on travel and a whole bunch of other things. But one of the things the NRA has done in the past 40 years is they've cultivated intense support from a grassroots segment of the American population that is ready to be highly, highly mobilized at the thought of anything that goes against their wide open view of the Second Amendment. So even if the NRA as an organization diminishes in its ability to run its PACs. They have a very highly developed, loyal group that as individuals will send a lot of money to people related to these things. And don't discount the fact that gun manufacturers can supply funding to other kinds of PACs as well, even if the NRA's capacity is diminished. So it isn't just that they gave a lot of money over time. It is they also cultivated and reinforced a segment of the population to be highly mobilized in support of their views. If you think about people who are one-issue voters, very often it's people aligned with the NRA who are one kind of one-issue voter. The only thing that matters to them is maximizing the availability of guns, because the NRA has told them to be very, very afraid that the government is coming to take all your guns. Hey, there's 400 million guns on the loose in the United States. Nobody could take your guns. And that's why we really ought to step back from that ideology and the cultivation of that fear and say, look at the things we can agree on: background checks, safe storage, right, that are not a threat to you at all. And yet the ideological rigidity and intensity that the NRA has successfully cultivated in a minority of the U.S. population still maintains a kind of influence, especially for politicians who represent areas where that particular segment of the population may be more numerous or more politically influential.
On the other side of the argument, Dr. Smith, there are those that say, well, we can put all these safety measures in place, we can put all these precautions in place legally in terms of obtaining a firearm, but there's still going to be people out there that are going to get their weapons illegally if they can't get them through legal processes. So what do you say to that camp and to that argument, as well as answering as well as what can we do to then answer that issue? Because it is a very real possibility that we put all these laws in place, we change all these policies. They do play a significant help in addressing this issue, but does not necessarily solve the issue.
I never talk in terms of solutions, not with 400 million guns out there. And there's no reason to talk about the possibility of future problems. We can talk about the inevitability. It's going to happen. No matter what laws you have, we're going to have a problem of gun violence. What we're talking about is reducing risk and harm. So I don't disagree with that sentiment. But on the other hand, I would say murders are inevitable, but we don't say, let's get rid of laws against murder, because there will be some murders anyway. We work to reduce risk and harm and save the lives that we can.
Dr. Smith, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.